Fear the Pale blew what we left ourselves episode 8. Bent the berth was smaller than the supply closet at Georgetown, and Renn measured it that way without meaning to, the way she measured most new spaces now, against a building she hadn't stood in for 3 months. Bunk bolted to the bulkhead, a desk surface that folded down from the wall and locked with a pin that stuck a little every time so that she had to use her thumb to seat it. No window. She set her bag on the bunk and didn't unpack it yet. The door had sealed behind her with a sound that came late, not by much. Half a second, maybe less, a lag between the motion of the panel and the click that told her it had actually latched. She stood and listened to it happen a second time, testing it, and it happened the same way again. Consistent. She filed that the way she filed most things now without deciding to. Down the corridor, a light fixture ran a low hum that she could feel more than hear. A frequency sitting just under the register where it would have been annoying enough for someone to fix. Nobody had fixed it. The air had a taste to it, metallic, thin in a specific way that reminded her of AB7 without being AB7, and under that a vibration coming up through the deck plating that she understood correctly to be the engines. Not a sound so much as a presence. It didn't stop. She noticed after 20 minutes that she'd stopped noticing it, and then noticed that she'd noticed and let it go. Her issued garment hung on the hook inside the door, gray-green ICD standard, heavier than it looked. She checked the inside pocket before she'd consciously decided to check it, 2 fingers in, confirming the shape of the photograph through the fabric without taking it out. It was there. She hadn't thought it wouldn't be. Her hand came back out and she stood for a moment with nothing in it. Someone knocked twice on the frame, not the door itself, and a woman's voice said her name like a question that already knew the answer. Renn. She turned. The woman in the corridor was 50-something, hair cropped short and going gray hard at the temples, a build that came from decades of ships and hangars rather than any gym. Flight suit, no insignia beyond a nameplate that said Alvarez over the breast pocket, sleeves pushed to the elbow like she'd been doing something with her hands before this. Captain, Renn said, Marguerite Alvarez, I run this boat. Alvarez looked past her into the berth, a fast professional glance, checking nothing in particular and everything at once. You settling in okay? I know it's not much. It's fine. It's small. Everyone says fine the first day. Ask me again in a week. Alvarez said it without much weight behind it. A line clearly said to 100 people before Renn and one that would be said to 100 more. We run a 6 and 6 watch rotation out here. 6 hours on whatever your function is. 6 off, with 2 4-hour blocks a day where nothing's scheduled and you can do what you want with them. Meals in the mess, posted times, but nobody's checking if you eat on schedule or not. Backer runs nav. Cho runs recovery support, and you'll meet both of them before the day's out if you haven't already. I haven't. You will. Alvarez leaned a shoulder against the frame, unhurried. Can I ask you something? You can ask. I've had closers ride recovery ops before, read-ins even. Never had one come out this far for something my orders call routine. She said it plainly, no edge in it, a woman noting a fact rather than building toward an accusation. Not asking you to violate anything, just curious what a routine haul rates a closer of your level. Renn had an answer ready before the question finished, the way she'd had answers ready for 15 years, a shape built to fit exactly the hole a question like that left. Command wanted eyes on it given the age of the recovery site. Nothing more exciting than that. Alvarez looked at her for a second longer than the answer required, not suspicious, just weighing it the way a person weighs anything that doesn't quite finish closing. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied enough, or at least willing to let it sit unsatisfied. Fair enough, above my clearance to ask twice anyway. She pushed off the frame. Mess is 2 decks down aft. You'll hear it before you find it. Backer talks with his hands and it carries. Noted. First transit's always the longest one, Alvarez said, already half turned to go. Body doesn't know what to do with itself yet. Give it 3 days. She paused at the end of the corridor, one hand on the frame of the next hatch. Alvarez runs a tight ship, but not a quiet one. If something's wrong, you tell me. If something's classified, you don't, and I won't ask twice on that either. She said it like a rule she'd said 100 times, worn smooth from use, and then she was gone down the corridor toward whatever came next in her own 6 hours. Renn stood in the doorway a moment after the sound of her boots had faded into the general hum of the ship. The light fixture kept humming. The door, when she finally stepped back inside and let it close, sealed a half-second late again, same as before, and she found herself standing there listening for it a third time before she caught herself doing it and stopped. She unpacked slowly, not because there was much to unpack, there wasn't, but because the process of doing it gave her hands something to do while the rest of her sat with the fact of being aboard a ship she hadn't chosen, on a heading she had chosen, toward a place that didn't have a name yet beyond a region on a chart. The bag came apart into its known pieces. A change of clothes, functional, gray. A kit. The legal pad in its usual place at the bottom, and she did not take it out. Her hand found the shape of it through the canvas anyway. A check more than a search and moved on. The desk surface, once she'd folded it down properly and seated the sticking pin with her thumb, held almost nothing. A reading tablet, ICD issue, loaded with crew manifests and ship schematics she hadn't looked at yet. A cup, empty, bolted mount beside it for transit turbulence that the ship apparently expected at some point on this heading. She sat on the edge of the bunk rather than the desk chair, which folded out from the wall on a hinge that groaned faintly every time. Another sound she cataloged without effort, the way her brain had been built over 15 years to catalog things whether she wanted it to or not. Somewhere aft, muffled through 2 decks of hull and hatch, she thought she heard someone laughing. She couldn't place the voice yet. She'd know it soon enough. The overhead light in the berth ran a shade cooler than the corridors, a detail that meant nothing and that she noticed anyway, filed under nothing, gone the moment she stood up. She checked the pocket one more time before she left to find the mess, 2 fingers in, the shape confirmed, her hand out again before she'd let herself think about why she kept doing it. The corridor outside her berth ran narrower than the one at Georgetown that led to the supply closet, narrow enough that 2 people had to turn sideways to pass without touching, and the deck plating underfoot had a texture to it, raised diamond ridges worn smooth in a path down the center where 6 years or 60 of boots had walked the same line. She followed the path without thinking about it, the way a person follows a trail through grass that's already been cut. Handrails ran along both walls at waist height, welded rather than bolted, and every 20 feet or so a hatch marking read out in stenciled block letters, numbers and letters in a code she didn't yet have memorized. Frame 14, frame 15. The numbers climbed as she walked aft, and she understood without being told that the ship organized itself the way most ICD vessels did, by structural frame rather than by deck or compartment name. A system built for engineers rather than for the people who had to live inside what the engineers built. A crew member passed her going the other direction, someone in coveralls with a tool bag slung over one shoulder, and nodded without breaking stride, an acknowledgement that assumed she belonged there without needing to confirm it. She nodded back. Nobody had told her yet whether her clearance would be visible to the crew, worn or badged or simply known, and she decided she'd find out by watching how people treated her rather than by asking. Near the ladder well that dropped toward the lower decks, she paused. The vibration through the deck was stronger here, close to whatever ran the length of the ship's spine, and for a moment she stood with one hand on the rail feeling it travel up through her palm, a low continuous thrum that didn't rise or fall, that simply was, the way weather was, the way the sound of a highway was to someone who lived close enough to one to stop hearing it as separate from silence. She thought, briefly and without deciding to, of the hum in the walls at Georgetown, the building's own version of this, older and slower and made of steam pipes rather than whatever reverse-engineered propulsion system pushed this hull through the dark. Different building, same category of sound, the kind of place made when it was working the way it was supposed to work. She took the ladder down 2 decks, hand over hand, boots finding the rungs by feel before her eyes had confirmed them, and came out into a wider corridor where the smell changed, food now, something with onions in it, and a sound underneath the general hum that she recognized after a second as someone talking fast and someone else laughing at whatever they'd said. That would be the mess. She didn't go in yet. She stood at the hatch a moment, hand on the frame, letting herself hear the shape of the room before she stepped into it, a habit that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with 15 years of walking into rooms full of people she didn't know and needing, for half a second, to know what the room was before it knew she was there. The mess held 4 tables bolted to the deck, benches instead of chairs, and a serving line along the far wall where a man in a stained apron ladled something brown and thick out of a warmer that had seen better decades. Renn took a tray without being asked, filled it without much interest in what was on it, and looked for a place to sit that wasn't the center of the room. "You're the closer." The voice came from a man already seated 2 tables over, tray half finished, who'd looked up when she came through the hatch and hadn't stopped looking. He waved a hand at the bench across from him, an invitation more than a request. "Come sit. I don't bite and neither does the food, mostly." She crossed and sat. Up close he was compact, mid-30s, quick hands that moved a fork like he'd done the motion 10,000 times without thinking about it once. His coveralls had a patch on the shoulder, recovery support stitched in block letters that had faded from black to a soft gray, the same wear pattern as the deck plating outside her berth, and she filed the detail without knowing yet what she'd do with it. "Elias Cho," he said, and put out a hand. She shook it. His grip was firm without trying to prove anything. "You'd be Renn. Whole ship's been talking about you since yesterday. Not in a bad way," he added before she could ask. "Just we don't get closers out here much. Backers convinced you're here to babysit us. I told him closers don't babysit, they close things, but he wasn't having it. He's not wrong to wonder. Nobody's wrong to wonder on this boat, that's half the fun of it." Cho went back to his tray, ate a forkful of the brown thing without any visible opinion about it, one way or the other. "Recovery support, that's me. I run the equipment when we get wherever we're going, cataloging, containment, whatever the site needs. Mostly it means I spend the transit checking gear that already works and will keep working whether I check it or not, but command likes a log, so I keep a log." He said it without complaint, the tone of a man who'd made peace with the gap between what a job required and what it actually took. "How long have you been ICD?" 6 years. Recovery support the whole time, different postings. Before that, I fixed climate systems for a shipping company out of Long Beach, which sounds like a big change and mostly isn't. Machines don't care what they are built to do, they break the same way. He smiled at that, easy, like it was a line he'd used before and still liked. "You've got 15 years, they tell me. That's a long haul. It adds up. Everything does." He didn't push past the deflection, didn't seem to notice it as one, just moved through it the way water moves around a rock and kept eating. Somewhere behind him, at another table, someone laughed loud enough to carry, and Cho glanced over without much interest and went back to his tray. He hummed while he ate. Not a tune exactly, nothing she could place, just a low, tuneless sound that came and went under his breath, a noise a person makes without knowing they're making it. She'd have missed it in a louder room. Here, with the hum of the ship underneath everything else, it sat just audible, a second layer of sound riding the first. "You've got kids," she said, not a question, looking at the corner of something folded and soft-edged sticking half out of his breast pocket, paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times to go soft at the creases. He looked down at it like he'd forgotten it was there, which she doubted, and touched it once with 2 fingers, the same gesture she'd used on her own pocket an hour before without either of them knowing it. "One, May, she's 7. He didn't take it out to show her, didn't make a thing of it. She drew me a rocket ship before I shipped out this rotation. Terrible rocket ship. Fins in the wrong place, engine pointed sideways, whole thing looks like it'd tip over on the pad. I love it more than anything I own." He said the last part plainly, no performance in it. A sentence a person says because it's true and doesn't need dressing up. "She thinks I fly cargo runs. Easier than the alternative." Easier for who? He glanced at her, something flickering behind his eyes that wasn't quite surprise, gone before it fully landed. "Good question." He didn't answer it, went back to eating instead, and she let it go, watching him the way she'd learned to watch Walt without ever explaining to herself why she watched him. A habit built out of some part of her that noticed decent people the way other parts of her noticed exits and sightlines. He ate like a man who'd learned to enjoy bad food because the alternative was minding that it was bad. He talked with his fork sometimes, gesturing with it mid-sentence, catching himself and setting it down. She asked him about the equipment he ran, mostly to keep him talking, and he answered at length, cheerfully, walking her through containment protocols for recovered materials with the specific dry enthusiasm of a person who liked his job, even when his job was checking gear that didn't need checking. Vacuum-sealed containment units, radiation baseline scans, chain of custody logging that had to be done by hand because command didn't trust the automated systems past a certain classification tier. None of it was dramatic. All of it was a competence that came from doing something long enough that the doing of it stopped requiring thought, and she recognized that too in herself in a different shape. At one point he stopped mid-sentence, fork raised, and frowned at something over her shoulder. That's Priya's tray going into the recycler without her finishing it. Third time this week. He said it like it mattered, like the small failure of someone else's appetite was a fact worth tracking. And then he shrugged and let it go and picked his sentence back up exactly where he'd left it. Containment units, baseline scans, the exact gauge of the vacuum seals they used on anything pulled from a site with unknown atmospheric history. He asked her, at one point, whether she'd ever run recovery herself, hands-on, and she told him no, mostly true, and he nodded like that confirmed something he'd already guessed about closers in general. The serving line ran out of the brown thing partway through, and the man in the apron swore at it in a language she didn't recognize, and Cho laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that made two people at the next table look over. He caught her not laughing and didn't seem to mind. "You'll loosen up," he said. "Everybody does eventually. Ship's too small to stay buttoned up the whole transit." He said it kindly, not as a challenge, and went back to scraping the last of his tray clean with the side of his fork, a habit that struck her as domestic, out of place. For a man 3 weeks from a destination, none of them had a name for yet. She finished her own tray without tasting most of it, the way she ate most meals, function rather than pleasure, and Cho didn't comment on that either, just talked through the rest of the meal about nothing much. A broken climate unit on his last posting, a bet he'd lost to backer over a card game she hadn't heard of yet, the 7-year-old logic of a rocket ship with its engine pointed the wrong way. By the time the mess started to empty out around them, she'd learned more about him than she'd learned about anyone in weeks. None of it operationally useful, all of it filed anyway, the way she filed everything. Later, back in her berth, she pulled up the crew manifest on the reading tablet, more out of habit than need. Scrolling through names and postings and clearance codes she'd mostly already absorbed from the mission brief. Cho's entry sat where she expected it. Recovery support, 6 years ICD, routing code current as of 11 days before departure. 11 days. She looked at the routing stamp a second time, the placement authorization beneath it. A signature block she recognized from a folder she'd opened in a different building 3 months ago. A folder with a name attached to it that hadn't had a face until this morning. She didn't reach for anything. Didn't open the legal pad. Didn't write anything down. Didn't do more than sit very still on the edge of the bunk with the tablet in her lap, and the confirmation sitting in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed on purpose. The signature matched. She'd known it would, somewhere underneath the part of her that still needed to see it in writing before she'd let herself believe it. Healy had put Cho on this ship. Cho, humming over a bad dinner, showing her a badly drawn rocket without showing it to her at all, had no idea that anything about his posting was anything other than ordinary. And she set the tablet down on the desk surface and looked at the wall for a while, not doing anything with what she now knew except holding it, filing it somewhere that wasn't the drawer, somewhere closer to the front of her attention than that, a place she'd learned over 15 years to keep separate from everything she'd decided to let go of. The hum of the light fixture in the corridor outside carried faintly through the door. She sat with it until it stopped being separate from the silence, the way everything on this ship eventually did, and then she got up and put the tablet away. Backer found her on her second day, in the corridor outside the mess, and didn't so much invite her to the navigation bay as assume she was already coming. "You've got clearance for it, right? Come look at something. You'll like it, I promise. Everybody thinks nav is boring until they see the actual charts." He was 40s, light-built, with the restless energy of a man who talked with his hands the way Alvarez had warned her he would, sentences punctuated by little chops and sweeps that drew the shape of what he meant in the air in front of him. She followed him 2 frames forward and up a short ladder into a compartment that felt different from the rest of the ship the moment she stepped into it. Quieter. The engine hum still present but further off, muffled and lit by actual light rather than the fixture hum fluorescence of the corridors. On the way up he talked the whole time, half over his shoulder, about the ladder itself, an older design than the rest of the retrofit, original to the hull before the ICD had gotten hold of it and rebuilt half the interior around a propulsion system nobody who walked these corridors had designed. "Bet you didn't know that," he said, not really asking. "This whole ship's a patch job. Good patch job, but a patch job. You'd be amazed what's original and what's not if you knew where to look. I know where to look. Occupational hazard." He laughed at his own joke before she could decide whether it was one, and kept climbing. The nav bay had windows, real ones, reinforced, 3 of them set into the forward bulkhead in a shallow curve, and she stopped for a second without meaning to, because she hadn't seen an actual window since boarding and some part of her had stopped expecting to see one at all. Outside, the dark sat flat and enormous and mostly empty. No visible stars close enough to read as anything but pinpricks, and she looked at it a beat longer than she needed to before Backer's voice pulled her attention back into the room. "Ignore the view. Everybody does that the first time. You get used to it," he said, already dropping into the chair in front of the main console. 3 curved screens arranged around a central display that currently showed nothing but a status readout and a slow pulsing heading indicator. "I wanted to show you something because, honestly, nobody down in the crew pit cares about nav history, and you've got the clearance and I don't know, the look of someone who'd find this interesting. Try me." "Okay." He pulled up a menu with 3 quick taps, and the central display resolved into a star field rendered flat, a schematic rather than a photograph. The solar system laid out in concentric arcs with the outer reaches stretched wider than scale to make room for detail. This is every ICD recovered tech expansion route on record. 80 years of them. Every mission that used reverse-engineered propulsion to go somewhere past the belt, logged and overlaid. He tapped again, and lines began to populate the display, dozens of them, then more than dozens, colored by decade, layering over each other in a dense tangle that looked for a moment like nothing at all. Noise, a scribble. That's a lot of routes. That's 80 years of routes, yeah. Here's the thing, though. He leaned forward and adjusted a dial that Renn hadn't noticed until his hand found it, and the display began to rotate slowly, pulling back. The tangle of lines resolving from noise into something with a shape once the perspective shifted far enough out. "Watch the outer third. Don't watch the lines. Watch the gap." She watched. It took her a few seconds, the way an image in a puzzle takes a few seconds to separate itself from the background around it. And then it was there and she couldn't unsee it. A gap. Not empty space exactly. There was nothing marked as forbidden or restricted anywhere on the display. No boundary line, no warning color. Just an absence where lines should have been and weren't. A rough teardrop of unmarked dark sitting out past the belt with 80 years of expansion traffic curving neatly, unremarkably, around its edges. Not one route passed through it. Not one route came close enough to graze it. Every single line on the display, whatever decade, whatever mission, whatever destination, bent around the same patch of nothing like water finding its way around a stone that wasn't visible from where the water stood. "Isn't that wild?" Backer said, and he sounded genuinely delighted, the tone of a man showing off a magic trick he still didn't fully understand himself. "I noticed it maybe 2 years ago, just messing around with the archive on a slow watch. At first I figured there was a hazard flag there, debris field, unstable gravity well something. Pulled every survey record I could find. Nothing. No flag, no hazard, no reason on paper. It's just nobody's ever gone through it. 80 years of traffic and it's like there's I don't know, a habit nobody remembers starting." Renn's hand had come up without her deciding to move it, hovering a few inches from the display, close enough that the light from the projection caught the edge of her fingers, and she held it there without touching the screen. Her own pulse ran louder in her ears than usual, and she was aware of the stillness of the room, the windows dark pressing in from 3 angles, Backer's voice still going somewhere behind her attention, cheerful, uncomplicated, entirely unaware that he had just handed her 80 years of evidence for something she'd only ever had as a private certainty. "You said you checked the surveys," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. "Everyone I could pull, nothing flagged. I even asked an old-timer about it once, guy who'd been running nav since before I was in the program, and he just laughed short and said space is full of places people don't go for no clear reason, and maybe he's right. Maybe it really is nothing." Backer shrugged, easy, unbothered. A man who'd already filed his own curiosity somewhere comfortable and moved on with his life. "I still think it's wild, though. 80 years and nobody's ever asked why. Maybe somebody should. Maybe. Above my pay grade." He said it lightly, already reaching to zoom the display back out, already halfway to some other thought, and if he noticed that Renn hadn't moved her hand yet, hadn't lowered it, was still holding it an inch off the glass like she was afraid of what would happen if she made contact, he didn't say anything about it. She lowered her hand eventually, slow, deliberate, and folded it into her lap instead. On the display, the gap sat exactly where it had sat a moment before, unbothered by her attention. 80 years of human caution bent around it like a road built to avoid a house nobody remembered was haunted. She thought briefly of Backer's word for it. Habit nobody remembers starting. It fit better than he knew and worse. "Where's the destination on this?" she asked, keeping her voice level, professional interest and nothing more. "The recovery site." Backer tapped a marker deep inside the gap itself, a small point flagged in the ship's own current mission color, sitting almost dead center in the unmarked dark. "Right there." Which is funny, actually, now that you ask, because that makes us the first logged mission in 80 years going anywhere near it. He said it like a piece of interesting trivia, nothing more, already moving his hand to close the display down. "Guess somebody upstairs finally wanted to know what's out there." "Guess so," she said. Backer filled the silence without noticing it was one, running through a story about a nav officer he'd trained under years back, who used to claim he could feel a course correction in his teeth before the instruments registered it. A claim Backer had never believed and still repeated fondly, the way people repeat stories about the dead or the retired regardless of whether the stories were ever true. She half listened. Most of her was still on the gap, on the deliberate uselessness of describing 80 years of avoidance as a habit nobody remembers starting, a phrase that would have meant nothing to her 3 months ago and now sat lodged somewhere she couldn't easily dislodge it. "You all right?" Backer asked, catching something in her face she hadn't managed to smooth all the way out. "You've gone quiet." "Just thinking about the routing," she said. "It's a good catch. You should log it properly, not just as a curiosity." "Yeah, maybe." He didn't sound convinced, already reaching for his coffee, already 3 thoughts ahead of the conversation. Command doesn't usually care why old traffic looks the way it looks. They care about the new heading, and the new heading's this one, straight through the middle of it. Kind of ironic when you think about it. 80 years of going around, and here we are aimed right through the center. "Kind of," she agreed and let the word sit, one of only a handful she'd allow herself for the rest of the episode, spent here on purpose. He powered the display back to its resting status readout, the tangle of 80 years folding itself away into a single pulsing heading line, and turned in his chair to grin at her, pleased with himself, pleased with the view, pleased with an audience who'd actually looked instead of nodding along out of politeness. "Told you you'd find it interesting." "You did. Come back anytime. Nobody else on this boat appreciates a good chart." He said it easily, already turning back to his console, already forgetting, the way a man forgets when he has no reason to remember, that he had just shown a closer of Renn's clearance level the exact shape of 80 years of institutional avoidance, and that she had looked at it the way a person looks at their own handwriting on a note they don't remember writing. She stayed a few minutes longer than she needed to, watching the windows, the flat, enormous dark outside them broken by nothing she could name, and then she thanked him and left the way she'd come, down the short ladder, back into the corridor's fixture hum and metallic air, carrying something she hadn't been carrying 20 minutes before. By the 3rd evening, ship's time, the mess had emptied of its dinner, crowd down to a single table near the aft bulkhead, and Cho waved her over before she'd fully decided whether she wanted company. Backer was already there, cards fan in one hand, and Alvarez sat across from him with her boots up on the bench beside her, off-duty enough that she looked 10 years younger than she had in the corridor 2 days before. "Closer," Backer said by way of greeting, not looking up from his hand. "You play?" "Not really. Nobody really plays. You learn as you lose." He dealt her in any way, sliding cards across the table with a flick of 2 fingers, and Cho scooted down the bench to make room, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the faint machine oil smell that lived permanently in the fabric of his coveralls, no matter how many times they'd been through the ship's laundry. A deck of cards on this ship, she noticed, had a heft to it, thicker stock than what she'd have found in a Georgetown drawer, corners worn soft and rounded from what had to be years of shuffling by hands that didn't know or care whose hands had held them before. Someone had drawn a small, faded star in permanent marker on the back of the 2 of clubs, long enough ago that the ink had gone brown at the edges, and nobody at the table remarked on it, which told her it had been there longer than any of their postings. She turned the card over once out of habit, checking, and set it back down without comment. Above the table, a heat vent ticked at intervals that didn't quite match the rhythm of anything else in the room, expanding and contracting with the ship's own internal weather. And somewhere further off, a door somewhere in the mess complex sealed with the same half-second lag as the one on her own berth. A small mechanical honesty the whole vessel apparently shared. The game turned out to be something Backer had learned from a cousin in Alexandria, half poker and half a bluffing game she didn't recognize, rules that shifted depending on who was explaining them, and that nobody seemed inclined to pin down definitively. She lost the first 3 hands without much effort at holding onto them. Cho lost worse, cheerfully, narrating his own bad decisions out loud a half-second after he'd made them, which struck her as either an odd tell or a deliberate strategy she hadn't figured out yet. "This food," Alvarez said, apropos of nothing, prodding at a foil pouch of something reconstituted that had been dinner an hour ago, "has gotten worse since the last supply run. I'm putting it in the log." "You put everything in the log," Backer said. "That's what the log's for." She said it without heat, an old argument worn comfortable between them, an exchange that had clearly happened 100 times on 100 different transits, and would happen 100 more before this one ended. "Last run they gave us the good coffee and this. I'd have traded." "Nobody asked you to trade. Nobody ever does. That's the tragedy of command." Alvarez tossed a card down, folded her hand, and reached for the coffee that apparently hadn't been the good kind after all, judging by the face she made drinking it. Cho told a story about a posting he'd had 2 years back, a supply vessel with a captain who insisted on hand-watering an actual, illegal, contraband tomato plant in a supply closet for the entire 8-month transit, on the grounds that a ship without something green in it wasn't a ship worth serving on. The plant had died in month 6. The captain had held a small, entirely serious funeral for it in the cargo bay, attended under some duress by the whole off-duty crew. "Did it have a name?" Renn asked, mostly to keep the story going, and found she meant the question. "Gerald," Cho said, without a beat of hesitation, and the table dissolved into the easy laughter that comes the longer people have been trapped together in a small space. Even Renn felt her mouth do something at the corners that she didn't examine too closely. Backer laughed hard enough that he had to set his cards face down to keep from showing his hand, which Alvarez immediately called out, gleeful, and used to win the round on a technicality nobody bothered contesting. The conversation wandered the way conversations wander when nobody's steering it anywhere at all. Alvarez told a shorter story about a bad landing on a moon whose name Renn didn't catch, involving a cracked strut and 4 hours of creative engineering that had apparently become minor ship legend. Backer complained, at length, about a nav software update from 2 rotations back that had reorganized every menu he'd spent a decade memorizing, a grievance he clearly nursed the way some people nursed old injuries, bringing it up whenever the conversation gave him an excuse. "Long way around," Cho said at one point, shuffling the deck between hands, not looking at anyone in particular. "That's what my old chief used to call any job that took longer than it should have, the long way around. Half the jobs I've had, that's basically the job description." He laughed easy and dealt the next hand. It landed wrong. Renn felt it land wrong somewhere under her ribs, A small cold click that had nothing to do with the cards in front of her, and everything to do with a display 2 decks up. 80 years of routes bending around a gap that had a name for exactly nobody currently sitting at this table except her. Nobody else at the table felt it. Backer picked up his cards. Alvarez asked whether anyone had seen the duty roster for the morning. Cho hummed something tuneless under his breath while he sorted his hand, same as he'd hummed over dinner 2 nights before, unbothered, unshadowed. A man who used a phrase like the long way around the way anyone uses a phrase, without weight, without knowing that somewhere in the room the words had found a different, heavier shape and settled into it. She played the next hand mostly on autopilot, aware of her own hands moving cards without much input from the rest of her, and lost again badly, which Backer found more amusing than her losing well would have been. "You're thinking too hard," he told her. "It's cards, not clearance review, apparently. Everybody thinks too hard the first week," Alvarez put in, not unkindly, gathering the discards into a rough pile. "Give it time. You'll be losing on purpose just to end the hand faster, same as the rest of us." She said it like a diagnosis she'd made 100 times before and never once been wrong about, and reached across the table to steal a card from Backer's discard pile that he swore, loudly, she had no legal right to take, an argument that dissolved into the bickering that only happens between people who trust each other enough not to mean any of it. "She's got a poker face for everything except poker," Cho said, grinning, and the table laughed again, and this time she let herself laugh too, a short, real sound that surprised her a little on its way out, the first one she'd allowed herself since boarding. Cho looked pleased with himself for causing it, an uncomplicated pleasure that had nothing calculated in it at all. The game ran another hour past when Renn would ordinarily have called it a night, extended by Backer's insistence on one more hand, then one more after that, then a final round that Alvarez won decisively and gloated about with a straight face that made Cho laugh so hard he had to put his head down on the table for a second. Someone had left a half-eaten pouch of the reconstituted dinner sitting forgotten near the edge of the table the whole time, and nobody claimed it or threw it out, and it sat there through 3 more hands like a small, unremarked monument to nobody's appetite. The ship hummed underneath all of it, the recycled air carrying its faint metallic edge, the low mechanical vibration through the deck, a constant nobody in the room commented on because nobody in the room except Renn still noticed it as separate from ordinary silence. When the game finally broke up, Cho gathered the cards into a neat stack, tapped them square against the table twice out of some private habit, and wished her a good night with the same easy warmth he'd shown her over dinner 3 days before. No different, no less, a man entirely unmarked by anything she now knew and he didn't. In the corridor outside the mess, she passed the crew member with the tool bag again, the same one who'd nodded at her that first day, and this time he said goodnight to her by name, easy, like she'd already stopped being new. She said it back. It cost her nothing, and she found, a little to her own surprise, that she meant it. She walked back to her berth alone, past the light fixture that hummed at its unfixed frequency, past the door that would seal a half-second late when she reached it, carrying the sound of his laugh somewhere she hadn't asked it to go. Back in the berth, she sat on the edge of the bunk with her bag beside her and didn't open it. The legal pad was in there, at the bottom, under the change of clothes she hadn't worn yet and the kit she'd barely touched. 4 columns of her own shorthand, folded into a cover that had gone soft at the spine from 3 months of handling. The routing anomaly she'd started tracing back in a different building, on a different continent, before any of this had a name. The echo's ask, put to her plainly in a room she still sometimes thought about at odd hours. A private request from the level 0 man, the one she'd answered with a sentence she hadn't planned to say out loud. "You're describing Healy." Words that had left her mouth before she'd fully decided to trust them with air. And the 3 claims, none of them compatible with each other, all of them apparently true at once, waiting on the other side of a heading Backer's chart said nobody in 80 years had wanted to fly. She put her hand flat on the outside of the bag, didn't unzip it, felt the shape of the pad through the canvas the same way she'd felt the shape of the photograph through her pocket that first morning. A check rather than a search, confirmation without examination. She didn't need to open it. That was the part she sat with longest, turning it over without turning over much else. She'd read those 4 columns enough times in 3 months that she didn't need the paper anymore to know what was written on it. The pad wasn't information now. It was ballast, something solid to carry so the rest of it didn't have to float free in her head with nothing to weigh it down, and she understood. Sitting there, that not opening it was its own kind of decision, made on purpose, not an absence but a choice with a shape to it, the same as any other choice she'd made, since episode 6 walked her out of that office and back into a world that hadn't changed on the surface at all. Healy had placed Cho on the ship. That fact sat in the watching place now, not the drawer, next to the shape of the gap on Backer's display, next to the accumulating, uncomfortable arithmetic of everything she'd agreed to without telling anyone she'd agreed to it. She thought about Cho's daughter's rocket ship, fins in the wrong place, engine pointed sideways, and about the specific, deliberate ordinariness with which he carried it, and found that the 2 facts, Healy's hand and Cho's daughter, didn't sit easily next to each other in the same column of her attention, and made herself hold them there anyway, because looking away from an uncomfortable pairing had never once made it less true. The ship ticked around her, small sounds settling into the hull's general hum the way they always did after enough minutes had passed to stop hearing them as separate. Somewhere below, distantly, a hatch cycled. She thought briefly about Alvarez's mild professional curiosity in the corridor that first day, a question asked once and not pushed on, and wondered how long that would hold if Alvarez ever saw what Renn had seen on Backer's display and understood, the way Renn now understood, what 80 years of avoidance actually meant. Alvarez wouldn't see it. Nobody on this crew would see it unless Renn decided to show them, and she hadn't decided that, and doubted she would. She thought about the 3 claims without listing them out loud, without needing the columns in front of her to hold their shape. The ICD believed whatever sat at the end of this heading belonged to the institution that had funded the recovery, plain and simple, the same way the ICD believed everything it recovered belonged to it by right of finding. The Echo believed something else, something Renn had agreed to in private and hadn't reported, a belief that came with its own weight and its own cost, neither of which she'd fully priced yet. And the Level 0 man, 50 years inside a program most people didn't know existed, believed a third thing entirely, quieter than the other 2 and no less serious for its quiet. 3 claims, none compatible. She was carrying all of them into a gap in space that 80 years of institutional habit had apparently agreed, without ever saying so out loud, not to look at. Her hand was still resting on the bag. She noticed it there, the same way she noticed most of what her body did without asking it to, and left it where it was a moment longer before finally drawing it back and setting it in her lap instead. She thought about the drawer briefly, the place where she filed things she'd chosen to set down rather than track, and confirmed, without much effort, that none of what she was holding tonight belonged there. The steered route belonged in the watching place. Cho's placement belonged in the watching place. Even the Level 0 man's ask, months old now and no closer to resolved, stayed exactly where she'd put it the day she'd first understood what he was asking, active, unfiled. A live wire she checked the way she checked the pocket of her jacket, not because she expected it to have changed, but because not checking felt, to some old and stubborn part of her, like carelessness. At some point she got up and refolded the change of clothes at the top of the bag, unnecessarily, the fabric already square, and sat back down with the bag re-zipped and the pad no more open than it had been an hour before. It was a small, useless gesture, and she performed it anyway, a motion a body makes when the mind has run out of productive places to put its attention and needs somewhere for the hands to go instead. She caught herself doing it, recognized it for what it was, and didn't stop halfway through. The desk lamp threw a narrow cone of light across the folded-down surface, leaving the rest of the berth in a gray that wasn't quite dark, ship standard dimming rather than true night, and she sat inside that gray for a while without reaching to brighten it. 3 months ago she would have opened the pad, would have needed to see the columns laid out in her own handwriting to trust that she remembered them correctly. Tonight she trusted her own memory instead, which felt, she noted, like a change worth noticing even if she wasn't sure yet whether it was a good one. Outside the berth, the corridor light hummed its unfixed frequency, faint through the door, a sound she'd stopped hearing as separate from silence sometime around her second day aboard, and now only noticed when she deliberately went looking for it. The way she was doing now, sitting very still, listening to a small mechanical imperfection nobody had ever bothered to correct, because it had never once, in however many years this ship had been flying, actually failed. Ship's night, so-called, arrived on this vessel by declaration rather than by any actual dimming of a sun nobody aboard could see. The corridor lighting stepped down 2 levels at a fixed hour, the mess closed its serving line, and a soft chime ran once through the general address system to mark the transition, a courtesy more than a necessity, since nothing about the dark outside the hull cared whether the crew called it day or night. Renn had asked Alvarez about it once, in passing, and Alvarez had said simply that bodies needed the fiction even when the universe didn't offer it for free, and left it there. She lay in the berth with the desk lamp off and the corridor's dimmed light bleeding faintly under the door. The bunk was narrower than she'd have liked, and she'd stopped minding sometime around the second night, the way a person stops minding most small discomforts once the alternative is lying awake resenting them instead of resting. Her hand found the interior pocket of the vessel garment where it hung on its hook by the door, without her getting up, without her needing to see it. Just a reach and a press of 2 fingers against the fabric until she felt the shape underneath confirm itself. Still there. She hadn't thought it wouldn't be. She let her hand fall back to the mattress. The ship's hum came up through the bunk frame the way it came up through everything on this vessel. Steady, wordless, a sound with no beginning she could locate, and no end in sight before the transit's scheduled length ran out. Somewhere forward, faint enough that she might have imagined it, a hatch cycled and resealed a half-second late, the same small, honest failure repeating itself in some other part of the hull the way it repeated in her own doorway. A flaw the ship had apparently decided to keep rather than fix, the way people kept things sometimes, not because they couldn't be corrected, but because correcting them had simply never risen high enough on anyone's list to matter. She thought about Cho's laugh at the card table, unguarded, the kind that made other people look over. She thought about Backer's hand hovering near the display before she'd made herself lower her own, the 80 years folding down into a single line at his touch like nothing had ever been strange about any of it. Alvarez's flat, professional curiosity in the corridor that first day came back to her too, a question asked once and left alone, and wondered whether that kindness would survive contact with whatever waited for all of them at the end of this heading. None of it resolved into anything she could act on tonight. She let it sit anyway, unsorted, the watching place a little fuller than it had been 3 days ago, the drawer untouched, the legal pad zipped into her bag exactly where she'd left it, unopened, its 4 columns of shorthand doing their work now by simply existing rather than by being read. At some point she turned onto her side, facing the bulkhead rather than the door, a small readjustment that changed nothing about the room and did nothing to quiet the hum coming up through the frame, and stayed that way longer than the movement warranted. A seam ran along the bulkhead at eye level, welded rather than smooth, a detail she wouldn't have noticed in a better lit room and noticed now only because there was nothing else immediately in front of her to look at. She traced it once with her eyes without lifting her head, start to end, and let it go. Somewhere beyond the hull, unseen through a berth with no window, the heading held steady toward a patch of dark that 80 years of careful, wordless habit had built itself entirely around avoiding, and she was, as far as the ship's own records would ever show, the first person in all that time to understand exactly why the habit existed at all. Nobody else aboard carried that weight tonight. Alvarez slept believing in a routine recovery. Backer slept if he slept, pleased with a chart he thought was merely interesting. Cho slept with a drawing of a badly built rocket folded soft at its creases. 3 weeks from a destination he had no reason yet to fear. The chime that marked ship's morning was hours off still. She didn't check the time to confirm it. Some habits didn't need confirming, and she'd learned over 15 years which ones were worth the effort of checking, and which ones she could simply trust to hold. The same instinct that had kept her hand near the photograph without needing to take it out. The same instinct that had let the legal pad stay zipped in the dark of her bag one more night. The light fixture somewhere down the corridor kept its faint, unfixed hum, audible only if she went looking for it. And she found that she was, tonight, still going looking for it. Some part of her unwilling yet to let it fold all the way into silence. She lay in the dark of the berth and listened to the ship's hum and thought about how long they'd been going around it without anyone deciding to look.